Let's move on now to what I think is the most morally depraved thing that Congress has done, at least in my lifetime, and that is to censure Rashida Tlaib, the only Palestinian American serving in Congress, while the U.S. is supporting an ongoing massacre of Palestinians. I saw somebody point out on Twitter that the second person ever censured by Congress was censured for introducing a resolution proposing the abolition of slavery, which you weren't even allowed to talk about in Congress. There was a literal gag rule, and so for proposing that resolution, they censured the person. I think the absolute moral depravity on display in the House yesterday is just leaves me kind of speechless. There was some pushback, and so Mark Pocan here has been engaged in an ongoing war of words with AIPAC. We were hoping to have him on today, actually, to talk about this. His schedule didn't work. We're hoping to have him next week. This is a Wisconsin Democrat who has kind of eagerly been taking on the slings and arrows from AIPAC, and he said publicly the one reason he's doing it is if he doesn't do it, they're just going to attack mostly women of color and serving in the House for Democrats and some men of color as well. Jamal Bowman has been a kind of fiery opponent of AIPAC, which is trying to recruit, and it seems like they successfully have recruited a primary opponent to him as well. Here he is unleashing on AIPAC, which is airing ads against him. He says, when little kids in my district sit down to watch a princess movie, AIPAC is forcing them to watch lies about the worst violence people could possibly do to each other. As a father, it makes me sick. One of the things, and we'll play some of these in a second. One of the things that drove me the craziest about the debate yesterday, it's not just, I think, just on a free speech issue. Yeah. Just a free speech level, it's outrageous to censure a member of Congress. Jamie Raskin made the argument for Democrats on the House floor, and I thought he made a good one. He said, if anybody is going to censure or discipline a member of Congress for their speech, it should be their voters.
Agreed.
And he goes on and he says, there are 11 members of the chamber who voted to say that Turkey did not commit a genocide against Armenia. Should we censure them for that vote? And he went on, talked about Mike Johnson and his views on marriage equality.
Yep.
Should he be censured? And Raskin was making the point that Democrats are now going to be under extreme pressure from their party's base to censure people in return. So to me, all they've done is just like they've taken impeachment and made it kind of a moot power by overusing it. I think so you get censured now. It's going to end up becoming a badge of honor because what it means is that you angered the other party. So just on a free speech level, it was really offensive to me. But the other level was the way that they weren't even censuring her for what she believed. Like they kept twisting her words and saying, we're censuring her because she supports Hamas and she supports the eradication of Israel.
Right.
If she did, then even if she did that, I think on a free speech level, you should not censure her. Like, vote her out of Congress if you don't like that. But that's also not what she says. Like, she has condemned Hamas. She does not support the eradication of Israel. And so you wound up with a bunch of these Republican speeches of saying, well, this is how we interpret what she's saying, regardless of the fact that she says that that's not what she's saying.
Yeah.
And then we're going to condemn and censure that interpretation of it.
I think it's entirely reasonable for Jews to hear from the river to the sea and have incredible sensitivities about it, because obviously it's appropriated and used by people who do actually really want to, in some cases completely eradicate Jews, and in other cases eradicate Israel in a way that it's like, well, where do Jewish people go? Are they safe? So I completely understand heightened sensitivities around from the river to the sea. She also, actually, a lot of people forget about this, back in 2020, she had to undo a retweet of From the River to the Sea, which if you are a pro-Palestinian activist in the United States or basically anywhere, and you are a big voice that's interacting with all of these other accounts, it's such a common phrase from the river to the sea. And people can argue, again, people with, I think, reasonably heightened sensitivities about that can argue what that means. But in the same way, and I agree with Jamie Raskin on this, in the same way that we often talk about, I talk all the time about how the House of Representatives, we lose sight of the fact that it is essentially supposed to be representative. It's supposed to be where voters who have ideas across the spectrum because they live in different geographic locations are given a voice in Congress. And sometimes that means it feels icky to people. And that can go for Republicans and it can go for Democrats. Rashida Tlaib represents a heavily Muslim district in Michigan where what she's doing on this issue is fully representative of her constituents. So don't censure her. Make this a political question. You can censure somebody if they're not representing their constituents and they're being sort of wildly hateful and bigoted in a way that's different than what they got elected on. This is completely representative of her constituents. There's just no question about it. So you're going to need to beat her at the ballot box. I think a censure is a waste of time, and I think it's just an exercise in virtue signaling.
Right, and there's a couple interesting points to make there. One is that the Likud platform, Netanyahu's party, includes from the river to the sea in its platform. And it says that Israeli sovereignty extends.
From the Israeli perspective.
Yeah. So and then Hamas in its charter would say that Israelis and Jewish people need to be pushed out of the entire thing.
And by the way, I think that's why there's heightened sensitivities among pro-Palestinian people about when you hear Israeli lawmakers, for example, or you hear Max Miller talking about turning Gaza into a parking lot. It's an eradication of the Palestinian state, and people say, well, where are we supposed to go? So I feel like those heightened sensitivities are completely understandable when you hear people talking about either eradicating Gaza or eradicating Israel.
Right. And what Tlaib says she means, and what so many other people do mean by that, is that everyone living from the river to the sea should have dignity, the franchise, and the same civil rights as anybody else living in there. There are some supporters of Israel who say that that would destroy Israel. And there are other people who say, well, then what is Israel if the people who are under its control can't have basic civil rights?
Yeah.
How can you support that? So what she is standing for is basically a one-state solution in which everyone in this area is a part of a democratic polity. That doesn't necessarily mean that it can't have a Jewish character in its constitution. It doesn't mean that Jewish people from around the world can't still have Israel as a refuge. It doesn't mean that Hebrew wouldn't be the national language. It would mean that a Palestinian, just by virtue of being a Palestinian, would not have lesser rights than an Israeli settler, like living right next to them. That the settlers would not be able to just seize their homes. That if a Palestinian is accused of a crime, that the Palestinian would go to a civil court and have rights in court, rather than, as currently is the case for most, is put into a military court and held in indefinite administrative detention with no rights whatsoever, or just executed.
And it's sort of impossible to envision the path from point A to point B to this hypothetical one-state solution. And again, I get why that's, there are heightened sensitivities on that, because it's like, well, what does that look like? Are we talking about the what did y'all think decolonize meant tweet? Because there was just a civilian massacre and perpetrated by essentially the de facto government of Gaza. And so I get it. I totally understand why people have heightened sensitivities around this. And I think as a congresswoman, she is obviously sort of sensitive to those sensitivities, because I think she took the video down and she undid the retweet. Again, to be clear, she's not the one who said from the river to the sea. She tweeted a video of people chanting from the river to the sea, which I also think is a distinction. But either way, the point is Republicans and pro-Israel Democrats want to have it both ways. They want to say there's this shocking uptick in anti-Semitic sentiment, which I think there's good reason to believe that. They want to say there's this shocking anti-Israel sentiment around the country, but also we can't have this in the House of Representatives. Well, if there's a shocking amount of it in the country, it's going to be in the House of Representatives, and you're going to have to defeat it rhetorically. You're going to have to defeat it politically. You're going to have to grapple with it. You can't just censure it and pretend that it doesn't exist and that it's outside the bounds of what normal Americans think. Because there are people chanting Intifada in the streets. That's something you have to deal with as a politician.
Right, and which is not what she's doing. So,
right,
and
yeah.
it's this endless effort to kind of transform criticism of what Israel is doing into anti-Semitism rather than address head-on what Israel is doing. And the idea that this is the debate that the House was happening while people are starving, people are dying, not just under rubble, but from disease, from not having access to food and water for more than a month at this point. But let's play some of the debate from the House floor yesterday.
I can't believe I have to say this, but Palestinian people are not disposable. We are human beings, just like anyone else. My city, my grandmother, like all Palestinians, just wants to live her life with freedom and human dignity we all deserve. Speaking up to save lives, Mr. Chair, no matter faith, no matter ethnicity, should not be controversial in this chamber. The cries of the Palestinian and Israeli children sound no different to me. What I don't understand is why the cries of Palestinians sound different to you all. 71% of Michigan Democrats support a ceasefire. So you can try to censure me, but you can't silence their voices. I urge my colleagues to join with the majority of Americans and support a ceasefire now to save as many lives as possible. President Biden must listen to and represent all of us, not just some of us. I urge the president to have the courage to call for a ceasefire and the end of killings.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It is glaring hypocrisy when you have Republicans on the other side of the aisle trying to create definitions and say Rashida wants to annihilate people, when Max Miller himself went on TV and said we're turning Gaza into a parking lot and we want to annihilate Palestinians. Nobody condemned him on that side of the aisle. What is true here is that every single one of them has not acknowledged the fact that Palestinians are dying in the tens of thousands, but will continue to say it is us who are not acknowledging humanity. Rashida will stand strong.
Gentlelady's time has expired.
The movement will continue for liberation until every single Palestinian has the right to
Gentleman
live
from
in
Maryland
liberty.
is recognized.
All right, so we also have clips of Chip Roy, or we have video of Chip Roy from the floor yesterday. We can run that right now, too.
What we're talking about is whether a member of the United States House of Representatives, whether a member of this body representing this nation, is justified in putting forward a defense of the actions of Hamas terrorists that murdered innocent Israeli citizens, is holding United States citizens and Israelis hostage, and in her own language was defending on October 8th, a mere 24 hours into the brutal and barbaric attacks in which babies were beheaded, babies were placed into ovens, literally. Moms were raped in a house while their babies were put in an oven. A documented account, video evidence. And this is dismissed as resistance to an apartheid state.
So, I mean, I think I'm with Chip Roy's Freedom Caucus colleague Thomas Massey in voting against the censure thing. I think there was a handful of Republicans that voted with some of the Democrats and a handful of Democrats, I think 22 Democrats that did vote to censure Rashida Tlaib, a much smaller number of Republicans who voted with Democrats not to do it. And yeah, that obviously ended up passing last night. Ryan, you actually have your book here on the desk.
That's right.
It's got the faces of some of
Which I
the people
brought
you
for
just heard
that's right,
from.
'cause
Yeah.
apparently yours hasn't showed up yet.
It's a beautiful hard copy, a beautiful cover, but as somebody who's covered very closely The Squad, it's a perfect book title, for a long time now. It's a nice book. What did you make of their exchanges yesterday, which were really personal on the House floor, just among Rashida Tlaib, Ilhan Omar? What did that tell us about some of those dynamics?
Yeah, and for people who are just listening on the podcast, while you hear kind of Tlaib choking up, Ilhan Omar kind of comes up and puts a hand on her shoulder. You see Pramila Jayapal behind her, wiping tears away. This is they've been forged in this fight with AIPAC, which dates back to their rise. Like the books, bizarrely, half the book really focuses on this fight over Israel-Palestine issues, when that is not at all the book that I set out to write. But going back kind of through their trajectory in Congress, it was the case that made up about like half of their struggle and reshaped it through the way that AIPAC and DMFI entered into the kind of the Democratic primaries in 2022, making sure that anybody who was remotely critical of Israel was either pushed out or reframed their position completely. And so Democratic Majority for Israel, which has been so influential, was founded in February 2019 as a very direct and immediate and specific response to Ilhan Omar and Rashida Tlaib being sworn into Congress. Not anything they did, their presence, like the fact that they had made it into Congress was enough to push back on them. Then you had the first 6 months of 2019 just devoted to the question of whether or not Ilhan Omar should be censured for various criticisms that she made. You had that famous Benjamin's tweet that she did apologize for, and so the amount of time that was consumed by this issue was shocking. But to see its kind of climax here with this attempted ethnic cleansing of Gaza, I think shows that what they were going through was not just made up. Like this is a real thing, kind of reshaping democratic politics. And when we talk about ethnic cleansing, I'm curious for your take on this. It's not just debating a term and whether or not the word genocide should be used or not. It's like you have people who have studied genocide for decades, academics. You have people at the United Nations who've looked at this, extremely closely. All of them saying that the question of intent is always the hardest to prove. But what Israeli officials have been saying publicly about their intent, basically to clear out Gaza, creates the predicate for genuine, serious allegations of genocide, which the United States and Israel are both actively participating in. And it's one of the more shocking things. It's not that it's necessarily out of character for the United States to support something like this, yet seeing it unfold has just been shocking. It feels like a piece of me has died, like watching this unfold. And to hear the Biden administration say, we think that they're going overboard here. This is too much. But there's just nothing we can do. Oh, and also, let's make sure that they have tens of billions of dollars with no strings attached, is just insulting to the kind of ethical and moral fiber of, I think, everybody who's just watching this unfold and feeling a sense of complicity in it.
They also want to quote blank check and no strings attached in Ukraine. That's sort of how we've run our foreign policy, recently. And I completely disagree on the question of genocidal intent. That said, Shadi Hamid had a really good, over at the Washington Post, had a really good tweet about the way that even we prosecuted a bad war in Iraq with precision compared too. So if you thought that war lacked precision, obviously Gaza is a difficult situation for Israel to mount any type of response without bringing civilian casualties to staggering levels. But even so, the difference in precision in Iraq and in Gaza and the way those wars have been prosecuted is serious. And that's something I think lawmakers who are talking so much about aid to Israel need to seriously consider. And actually, we're going to talk about that in the next block. My final question for you, Ryan, just because you've covered this so closely, is they've been able to paper over these huge personal divisions between a Rashida Tlaib and a Hakeem Jeffries on the question of Israel, between an Ilhan Omar and a Nancy Pelosi on the question of Israel. Is this a moment where you have Democrats crossing the aisle actually to censure Rashida Tlaib, where perhaps the squad finally goes full Freedom Caucus and totally breaks with leadership? Or will they still be able to work together going forward?
And I don't think so, because leadership did not break with them on this.
That's true. That's true.
And the leader of the kind of the Democratic forces who sided with Republicans to censure Tlaib was Josh Gottheimer, who had multiple chapters are dedicated to Josh Gottheimer in this book, and he has been their most consistent antagonist throughout his time there. And he was kind of one of the first to jump out and say that he's going to support the censure of Rashida Tlaib here. I do think that it is giving them, I think it's giving people around the country something to believe in again, who had lost faith that there was anybody fighting for justice in Congress. And so I do think that could be one of the developments here. But also, what I think people need to understand, we love in the U.S. here to abstract away from the reality of the depravity of what we do around the world by talking about words and phrases and politics and horse race instead. But that doesn't change the reality on the ground. And I think that the devastation and the death toll in Gaza that we're going to finally have to accept as real in the coming weeks and months will change the way that people see this.
I think social media is completely undercutting the blob's ability to talk in abstractions. And when you look at public polling on Gaza and Palestinians, especially among the youngest people, which has been shocking to a lot of pro-Israel folks, a lot of the Republican Party, you have to understand that these devastating images of suffering in Gaza are flooding people's social media feeds. And that is really hurting, I think, people's ability to talk about these things in abstractions. By the way, the same thing happened on October 7th as some of these massacres were being live streamed.
Yes.
The abstractions are getting much more difficult, I think, for the foreign policy elite to carry on with.
And I think what happened on October 7th with some people who either defended what Hamas did or didn't denounce it is that they had such tightly curated kind of feeds that they didn't even know. And because they didn't have the kind of curiosity or the willingness to kind of look outside their feed, because they might not want to hear the answer to what had actually happened, and then they're locked into a position, and pride and ego kind of won't let them back down from that. But again, we're talking about people who are at the fringes of power, like way out, like just people who like can't even get a hearing inside DSA for the most part, rather than what we have on the other side, people like Congressman Mast, who Ilhan Omar talked about in her speech yesterday, who has said, I would caution my colleagues to use the phrase innocent civilians, because you wouldn't use the phrase innocent Nazi civilians, and who has said that Israel ought to turn Gaza into a parking lot.
That was Max Miller.
Oh, sorry, Max Miller. What did Mast say? Oh, Mast said the first thing, and Miller said the other thing. So this is two separate members of Congress. These are not anonymous people on a university chat board.
Hey, if you liked that video, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to Breaking Points.
If you want to see the rest of Counterpoints, go to breakingpoints.com to become a premium member and get the full uncut show every morning in your inbox and on Spotify.
Help us build independent news and get the full show every morning at breakingpoints.com.